and do that. Okay, so anybody have any questions that came up from last week that we didn't address or anything? Anything before we go back to the little meeting we were listening to? Okay, well, let's check back in with this panel. This one I have quite a few notes about things that I thought were not worth listening to. So we're going to skip a little more with this one than we did with the other one. So let me share that. Look at that. I think it's
A
working.
great kickoff, a lot of stuff on the table. And I've gotten several questions in from the audience, and I want to sort of try to group them around a couple of themes. And the first one is to the theme that seems to be a theme that has already come up, which is the question of what is the relationship between the way in which humans organize their relationships to one another and and technology. One of the questions we got said that both eco-modernist and degrowth solutions often tend to appear as technical solutions, although neither approach needs to appear as a technical solution. So what is the role of and I'd like to throw this particularly to both Holly and Kohei, how do you understand the ways in which the relationship between various forms of technology, the relationship of humans to nature, and to what extent are they in fact shaped by the relations between humans, social relations, class relations, and to what extent do they have an independent existence? So why don't I throw that back to both Holly and Kohei, whoever would like to get started off.
Yeah, let me briefly introduce my argument in chapter 5 of the Capital of Marx in the Anthropocene, because Dan also mentioned the problem of real subsumption. And we have from the 70s debates about whether socialism can actually use nuclear power. And some people say, no, we can have nuclear energy because once we have different kind of social relations, we can manage nuclear power in a different way, and it can be safe, it can be democratically managed, and so on. And those people seem to believe that, the social relations and technologies are actually two different things. And once we replace social relations with some other kind of relations, the technology can be used for the sake of other people in more just and fair way. And in chapter 5, I actually argued, no, this is not necessarily what Marx was thinking about, because his discussion of the real subsumption actually said that the social relations become signified, become reified within technology. It materialized. So in the sense that the way how the technology develops and how the technology concretizes itself is wholly mediated by the logic of capital. And then even we try to manage those technology in a democratic way in the future society, in the future post-capitalist society. We cannot, because these technologies are not neutral. It is designed from nature to be undemocratic and to be dominating nature and humans and so on. So I think in the sense that we need to talk about, I think if this logic of real subsumption is correct, we have to.
Okay, so subsumption is the word he was using there. And it seems to be a kind of technical point. That he's trying to make. So there's something that Marx called formal subsumption, which has to do with how wage labor relates to capital. And then there's something he calls real subsumption, which has more, that's not quite right. So I think formal subsumption, I think, is about the technology, how the technology gets integrated into the system. Real subsumption is how labor gets integrated into the system. And why that word why that fancy word subsumption is being used. I'm not sure because it doesn't seem like there's really a deep thought in there. It's just a point that Marx is wanting to notice that, well, technology has this relationship to the capitalist system, and labor has a relationship to the capitalist system, and capital takes over both of them, the subsumption bit. But it does it different ways with labor and different ways with technology. So there's an important point there, but I don't know. I find the language really a little frustrating because I think it's overly difficult.
What would be technology in the time of Marx?
Well, it's steam power.
Oh, okay.
That would be the big thing. Yeah, and actually, so steam power is a good example in a way because um, if you're relying on the power of a river, like to have a mill grinding grain, you can do that on a pretty low, small scale, and even I think saw this thing about the history of the Thames once, and they said that the River Thames running through London was once the most worked river in history because there are all of these little mills all along the side of it, using the water power to grind grains, or eventually to also run mills, or small machines to do some fabric work. But when you get to steam power, and I think this is the point he's making about nuclear power, when you get to steam power, you're working with machines that are big and processes that are huge, and so constructing those machines and using them requires larger organization. And so with nuclear energy, you have to have this huge facility and thousands of people. And so the whole by the nature of the technology, it requires this massive organization. So that's the subsumption somehow of the technology. It produces this big infrastructure that has to exist. So anyway, but the important point is just to do with how technology is relating to capitalism, or how capitalism is relating to the technology. Some technologies are going to require big systems, and those are going to be therefore a little bit more um, either difficult to make really democratic, um, because of their scale, or you'd have to figure out some mechanism by which you do that. But if you're thinking about, like, if you have solar panels, everyone has a solar panel on their roof, it's a very sort of democratic way of doing it compared to a nuclear plant.
Think about abandoning some of the technologies that we have today. They cannot be transformed into some kind of democratic and sustainable technologies anyway. So I think this is the beginning point for Marx to question his own earlier optimistic vision of historical materialism. Always technologies are progressive and so on.
Right. No, so that was sort of the important point, because remember, what he's arguing, sort of, that Marx had two big changes late in life. One was how he was thinking about historical materialism, and then the other was how he was thinking about the history of communes and the what we now call the global South. And so in both there are two changes that he makes in there, and so this is one of those changes.
Holly?
Yeah, I mean, I would disagree somewhat, and I want to also fold some comments that Dan made into my response. I don't think that technologies are totally neutral. I wouldn't say that, because the technologies we have been shaped by particular sets of social relations. And so my thinking is not that they are, free from that. They've been made by that. It's more that you could imagine and enact an alternative form of them. And so I don't think it's useful to think of them as good or bad. I know people use that as kind of a heuristic, but take, for example, something like hydrogen. You can think about so-called blue hydrogen, which is hydrogen made from natural gas with carbon capture and storage. There's at least two reasons why I don't think we should be producing that. I don't think it's a desirable technology. I think we should turn away. One is that it's just not a good choice for the climate for a bunch of reasons I won't go into. But the other reason is it's really, being shaped and used by different fossil fuel actors that have a bad track record and don't need any more profits from us. And then people say, okay, well, maybe we shouldn't have hydrogen. Actually, I think we need it for decarbonizing steel. I think steel is really important to have. And then they say, okay, green hydrogen is the good hydrogen, blue hydrogen is the bad hydrogen. By green hydrogen, I mean hydrogen made from electrolysis from water. And I don't think that, you could have green hydrogen that's also bad if somebody appropriated a whole bunch of land for the solar panels without consulting people, or if it's depleting water sources. It's really about how it emerges. It doesn't adhere in the technology.
Okay, Dan, would you like to?
Okay, this one I find a little puzzling. I'm not, because it seems to me that what we figured out about hydrogen is that it's not really an energy source. It's more a way of moving energy. And so if the energy, like she's just saying, if the green energy comes from like hydropower, well, then the hydrogen's not creating energy. You used energy to create the hydrogen. You can take the hydrogen somewhere else and then use it in a reaction to make water and power. But all you've really done is get the power back, is get the power from the I'm losing my words. From the dam, the big dam, making the electricity. You've just used the hydrogen as a way of moving that electricity from one place to another. So it's not that the hydrogen itself created any energy. It's just this middle entity in between where the dam is and where the electricity needs to get used. So that part seems kind of weird that she's even talking about hydrogen as an example of energy source. But anyway, but I thought it was just interesting. It was important for you all to hear that there are people that are pushing back on him in some ways, even if I don't quite understand it myself. Dan's reply I thought was a little bit just sort of vague, so I'm going to skip a little bit here to where we want to go. About here.
To various technologies, techno-optimism, which I'll hold to a bit later, because I hope that people could sort of talk about some of the issues of strategy. And there are two questions that have come from the audience that I want to read out and get people's response to. The first question is, quote, I'd be curious to hear speakers talk about the role of value standards and changes in behavior. Are they important in your view of left strategy in a future world? If so, how? If not, why not? How might values be determined and rooted? Also, do you think it's important to find different ways of, okay, we'll leave that till later on the non-human world. But then there's another question here question that says, in relation to the problem, quote, how to motivate workers to overthrow capitalism, I think that the experience of dignity, denial, and loneliness most workers and others face, together with the miseries of work and poverty in capitalist crises, the horrors of climate change, the emerging pandemics, provides a lot of motivation. However, this does not address the difficulty of the political processes through which to organize the overthrow of capitalism. I think the question here is trying to get to how do we go from current struggles, whether they're in the workplace, et cetera, against poverty, precarity, et cetera, to this eco-socialist future. Marx envisioned that it was through their workers' collective and democratic self-activity that they cast off the muck of ages, they become fit to rule, they change themselves in the process of struggle. How do you envision so that it doesn't come simply through adapting good ideas, good values, good morality? So I'd like each of the three speakers to talk about how they envision current struggles.
Now, here I just want to remind you that there are a couple of sort of visions that come out of Marx's work, and one of them is capitalism will collapse under its own contradictions. And so if you ask then, well, because Marx spends his whole life also in workers' organizations and agitating and different political parties. And so you ask, well, why are you doing all of this political work if the theory you've given us is just one that says capitalism is going to collapse on its own accord? And the answer then is, well, it's important for workers to experience democratic self-organization over time, such that when the system collapses, people will be capable of self-governing in the aftermath of that collapse. Now, he's obviously not talking about that version of, or that understanding of what Marx was talking about. So he's asking the other question. So the more Leninist understanding of Marx is, well, no, the workers are going to organize and make change. So if we're going to assume that it's not just about waiting for the collapse to come on its own, but we actually have to do something to make the change, how then are we going to make that change is the question he's asking.
Yeah.
Becoming these ecological struggles. Go ahead, Cohen.
I touch on that topic more in Slow Down book. My difference from the traditional reading is that I focus on the theory of metabolism, not the theory of exploitation. If we remain in the old paradigm of exploitation, I think the conception of revolutionary subjectivity is limited to the working class. And this is, often criticized, male dominant, productivist, and so on. But if we expand the sphere to the entire process of metabolic interaction between humans and nature.
Okay, now this also is kind of an important point, but a little subtle. So what he's saying is that what he's arguing is that the older reading of Marx is narrow in that it's centered around Marx's analysis of exploitation and how that works. That the worker spends 8 hours a day, produces a certain amount of value, but is only paid some fraction of that value, and then the capitalist keeps the rest of that as profit. And so that process, fundamentally unjust, ends up being experienced as fundamentally unjust, and thus he calls it exploitation. So there's always a sense that there's sort of this tension in Marxist thinking about analyzing capitalism and what capitalism itself does, but then also talking about the response to it. So how are people responding to what they're experiencing as exploitation? And so if the politics that you're organizing is all about that, then your focus is very naturally going to be on industrial production, because that's sort of where the most workers are located, or at least certainly were at Marx's time. Today, we might want to, it may not be the same emphasis on industrial workers, but you still need a focus on workers in the largest possible facilities. And it turns out Amazon is one of those facilities with their big warehouses. They have hundreds and hundreds of workers, and so that's now analogous to a big steel factory with hundreds and hundreds of workers to organize. So you can organize a bunch of people all in one geographical location. But what Saito's organizing or arguing here, sorry, what he's getting at is that if you shift your focus instead of focusing it on a critique of exploitation, you focus it on this critique of metabolism. What you notice is that the metabolic problem that he's talking about, which is how capitalism relates to the natural world and the fact that the natural world takes time to recover, and so you have to keep finding alternatives, that bit. If you focus on this metabolic problem, that does in fact affect everyone in the society, not just the workers, because everyone lives in the society that has the metabolic problem. Capitalists are busy trying to figure out workarounds to get around it. But they're still affected by it. That's why they find the workarounds, is because they're affected by it. But once once there is a limit, there's really nowhere else to go for cheap resources. Then this wall, this metabolic kind of wall of a problem that we run into is a global one, or universal one for society. And so that's why he's arguing there's more political advantage to focusing on that analysis, because it's going to naturally include everyone as sort of people who are victims of this process, instead of just a subset of the population, the workers.
The one who get affected is not just workers, but also women, indigenous people, or the other kind of non-humans, including, global north and south and so on. So that the entire sphere that is exploited or robbed by the logic of capital can be the starting point of resistance. And so I wanted to highlight that importance of theory of metabolism for imagining a new strategy. And actually, my concrete strategy is often criticized, not revolutionary enough, but I respond to those critics by saying that my proposal is aiming at non-reformist reform, as Andre Gotz once said. It's about decommodifying essential goods and services and creating or expanding, re-establishing the sphere of commonwealth. Many things are commodified and privately owned under capitalism, so we need to pay for those goods, essential goods and services. And for that, we need to work hard, and our life is very unstable. But once we starting to decommodify and making the public goods, and these things become publicly luxurious, publicly abundant for many people, because we can have free medical care, free education, free electricity, and free public transportation, free internet, then we will probably start behaving in a different way. We don't have to be only thinking about money, survival in the market competition, and that kind of egoistic behavior can be weakened, and maybe we have more room for engaging with public services, more political activities. And these things are not necessarily the case, of course. This is a little bit utopian, but at the same time, many things are really commodified in the US, in Japan, and compared to the European societies, the value standards are very different. And I think it's not coincidental that the degrowth is making a greater resonance in the European countries than in the US. So I think by decommodification, by making these public goods kind of a commonwealth, is a very important starting point for the left strategy for changing behavior and value standards in the global north.
Okay, Holly?
Now, there's a natural critique in there but that's going to take too long. If the problem is the environmental problems coming at us fast, we need to do something faster. And so even if that made sense, it's still too slow. And then second, people would say, well, yeah, but the history of capitalism tells us that as often as workers or everybody can force reforms on the system, the capitalists will come along and undo those reforms, which, is the history of how the New Deal got made and then undone, and why the health systems in England and Canada are so poor these days, is they're underfunded because the capitalists have been trying to undermine them ever since they were established. And so how do you fight against the power of that undoing everything that you can do that's progressive? And so it's like, why? So how would that work? That's ostensibly the argument for revolution, is you can't, the reforms won't work because the capitalists will just undo them. So you have to have a revolution. But he's obviously not a revolutionary. So.
And he did say it was somewhat utopian.
Yeah. So he's not hiding from the critiques that he knows are coming at him. He knows what's coming, and he accepts that. Yeah, I know some people don't agree with me. It's he has a very gentle style that way.
Mhm. So I think in terms of left strategy, I wouldn't start with changing in behavior in the way that people typically think about it. I think the first starting place should be with industry because that's like 30% of emissions and you don't have to influence so many actors. And so that's number one. And that buys a couple of years to start to build more political power and shared norms, shared values. I think that changes that enhance the visibility of things that need to happen. So, for example, you have local municipalities, you want to put heat pumps in their buildings, but you want the public to see somehow that there's a heat pump there or a solar panel or whatever, so that they're aware of these things. That's another first step. And then I think you need to build these public luxuries. So build a really awesome communal swimming pool, and then people won't have their own swimming pools, or they'll be more likely to give it up because it's fun to go to the social experience that's beautiful, right? Or build, housing that's attractive, that's smaller and more efficient. And then that change in behavior from buying a big mansion in the middle of nowhere to being like where the action is, that change will happen more organically. And I could go through lots of examples, but I think that when I think about changing behavior, those are the entrance points I start to think about.
Yeah,
Great.
unfortunately,
So yeah,
again, Dan's response I thought was a little too vague and uninteresting. So let me skip past that a little.
Although I have to say, in Chicago growing up, number one, every high school had a swimming pool, and
Every high school.
every
Wow.
high school, and it was part of our gym activity once a week. We went swimming or, practice swimming. And number two, we did have local parks that
Mm.
had swimming pools that I could take advantage of as a kid.
Hmm.
So that's interesting and of course, being an early boomer, I was very much affected by the FDR notion of community and common good and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and it's interesting. And then you contrast that with the way a lot of things happen in Los Angeles, that it's hard to find a park. It's most of the
Oh,
open green spaces in Los Angeles are golf courses because they just don't have that many. And so and people might point out, well, and the culture sort of suffers from it. Los Angeles has this very shallow,
well,
culture that doesn't have
oh,
a
that's true.
sense of community
It's,
to it because they don't have those same public goods. Um, but it also makes sense too if you're right on a big body of water, having a pool in every kind of major school system is a good idea because you're teaching people to swim. Because if they're going to be around the water, you want to teach them all how to swim.
and it took me aback because I lived in Phoenix for a long time.
Hmm.
And there were high incidents of drownings because everybody did have a pool practically in their backyard. And there was no mechanism, unless you had money to teach kids to swim.
Right. And then you'd also have to add, yeah, you could put fences around it or covers, but those require also extra money. Yeah, well, that's sort of a sad statistic. You think about it. Little
I
kids fall.
think it's improved, but
Yeah, over time. Well, I'm sure it gets cheaper to put up fences and covers, and they figure out different strategies
right.
over time.
But teaching kids to swim was not one of
Yeah,
them.
that seems pretty basic. You have a friend who's now 80, I think 82, and grew up in San Francisco and never learned to swim. And I just that was just crazy. How do you grow up on the coast and no one ever there were no pools, he was sort of too old for that and never learned to swim. All righty, let's see. What are we doing here? Uh, oh, who is going to do this organizing work? I think he's going to ask.
which is who is the agent of the process of decommodification? What is the agency of building public luxuries? What does this mean in terms of concrete organizing? Do people see this as primarily what we could call a state-led process affected by changing the minds of or the personnel of the current state? Or is this the result of people's more tumultuous social disruption from below? In other words, try to get at what is it concrete? What is the sort of political agents and agency we're looking for in this transition to an eco-socialist world, whether we conceive it primarily as degrowth or some eco-modernism. So, Kohai, why don't you start off again?
Yeah, it's not either or. It's not just simply about communal bottom-up organizing that can transform this planetary crisis, right? So it has to be built up, and then the state needs to also plan accordingly to shut down coal fire plants, and we also need to plan how we can actually end fossil fuel entirely. And this is not something that local groups can do. So we need also a kind.
Yeah, just occurred to me. This is sort of what the YMCA exists to do. That
Oh, that's right.
it's trying to provide public luxuries,
Oh,
but
that's right.
since it's not a government, it's limited to whoever can be a member of the organization, even though they'll try hard to make it as affordable as possible. But yeah, but it's interesting. Yeah, so there are
that's right.
private organizations doing some of this work.
Kind of top-down intervention in the entire process of production. And I think this is how the both sides, socialist side and degrowth side, can learn from each other, because degrowth people often emphasize the kind of bottom-up communities, eco-village, and those kind of small-scale democratic horizontal things. So these are all very important, but at the same time, it is not sufficient to tackle this planetary crisis. So I think the socialist tradition of even like a calculation debate about what we produce and the role of the state is very central in the discussion of Marxist and socialist tradition. So I think degrowth people need to learn from that Marxist aspect too. But the problem is there's this fundamental kind of misunderstanding, mistrust to each other. And then my book is basically the first intervention from a Marxist side, by demonstrating the kind of attitude that Marxism can also not only contribute to degrowth people, but also can learn from many things and present a more concrete vision of alliance for a better future. So, I mean, unionism is obviously important, and Fridays for Future, Extinction Rebellion, all those kind of environmental justice movements also important. But at the same time, unionism and climate justice movement somehow need to cooperate and learn from each other. And this is not, unfortunately, taking place. And I think this is a real challenge after years of climate justice movements. They are not scaling up enough, and then many activists are having some kind of dissatisfaction with the current way. And I have been having a lot of discussion how we do scale up and what kind of subjectivity, what kind of strategies. I don't have a full answer, I have to admit, but this is something that we can find a solution only by overcoming this antagonism between degrowth and eco-socialism.
Okay. Holly?
Yes, so I think one thing we can do is focus on building this connective infrastructure, social infrastructure between the federal or the state and local municipalities. Because what I've seen with the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act, modest as they are in the US compared to the scale of funding we need for clean energy, they do, allow billions of dollars for projects, but you need the expertise in these local places to be able to apply for that money. You need people who have time and vision, and a lot of cash. People are poised to, use it for their own vision, basically.
Dan?
Yeah, I mean, so I think this is really, of course, is like both like the most important and also like the hardest question, probably in some respects. And I don't have all of the answers. I think, and I don't think that there are any sort of like absolute statements that I want to make about it. I think that like sometimes there can be reforms that are made within existing political structures that open up new horizons, or that push us in the right direction, even if those aren't the intentions of the people doing it, right? That like sometimes the potential of changes sort of like escape the control of the ruling classes. At the same time, I very much worry about the emphasis on a certain sort of like brand of electoralism that I see in some sectors of the eco-modernist left in particular, where it's sort of like, well, we just need to get, like the electrical workers on our side, and then like all these contradictions will be solved. And there's really, I think, not a sufficient accounting for the like real structural limitations of existing political forms in particularly in places like the United States. The question of sort of like what it is that we're reproducing or sort of like helping to make viable in these settler colonial societies, right? Is this just sort of like guaranteeing a future for that colonialism? Are we sufficiently understanding the extractivism and ecological imperialism that are required to be able to maintain these ways of life, et cetera, right? So I think a lot of those questions get tabled when you're focused on that level of political intervention. So I think it can't just be, movements that go out in the street and protest and then fizzle out. But it also can't just be working within existing structures and electing the right politicians to the Democratic Party. So I think that the attempt to build, I think Kohei mentions Cooperation Jackson, and I had an amazing talk here from
Cooperation Jackson. You always heard of this? Jackson, Mississippi. They had elected a very progressive mayor some years back, and he started this initiative to build a lot of grassroots cooperative organizations to especially provide social services to underserved populations and generate economic activity. And it doesn't, I don't think it gets a whole lot of attention, in like nationally, but they seem to be doing some really good work and little by little building up the organizations, the scale of the organizations that they have. And so the general program is called Cooperation Jackson.
The founder of Cooperation Jackson a few weeks ago, Callie Kuno, is one really inspiring place to look, where they're trying to sort of like create ways of meeting people's needs, engage at these various different levels, but in a way that prevents their co-optation by sort of like bad actors in the existing political parties. So that's a really tough thing to do, but I think, and throughout the global South, there's also some exciting examples that we could point to. It's not impossible. It's just very hard for us to imagine here, I think.
Okay.
All right. So from there, they're just going to talk a little bit more about the importance of vision and our imaginations about what's possible. which is, as we know already, is the big emphasis Saito's making is we need to have people need to have a sense of where they're going in order to try and get there, which I think also makes sense. Okay, so from there, I wanted to move on to something a little different and a little more critical of Saito. But before I do that, do you all have any questions about what we were just seeing?
I just think that I'm fearful in this country because no one takes care of you. You have to do it yourself. So I have become more possessive. I'm not as generous as I used to be. Because in my aging, well, I have the children, but the institutions aren't there for a lot of people. And that's really different from Europe. We never had to worry about our parents. So do you know that when I came to the States, I was 20, that the FBI came and went into the streets and the homes where I had lived. The neighbors told us to see if we were communists or socialists. And of course, they never said, because my father was a communist when he was young. So, but that's what they did. Not only that, I had to go for a physical examination for the doctors to see if I was healthy or what. I walked around in my underpants for a bunch of doctors. It's shocking when I look back. At the time I was proud. I was idiots, so I was young. But when I look back, I think that was awful. I hope they're not doing that anymore. Although now they send people back. I know, it's kind of hopeless.
Elena, what year was that?
Let's see now. It was in the 50s.
And in the 50s, in what city?
In Dordrecht. It's the oldest city in Holland.
No, but you came over here to what?
Oh, here.
Yeah.
In Seattle. I came to Seattle.
Oh, in Seattle.
Yeah.
But the FBI was in Holland, right?
Yeah.
Elena?
Or what did the CIA or what? I don't know what it was, but the neighbors had told us that they'd come to see and ask what the family background was. Well, they just didn't know that there would be a socialist in America.
Before you came.
Me.
But they did that before you came.
Yeah, that is before I came.
So they did.
And I couldn't get my visa.
I see.
Unless they knew I was a safe person and healthy. And also, at that time, you had to have a sponsor. If you didn't have a sponsor, you couldn't go. Somebody who was responsible for you if you were sick or whatever.
Financially. That's still the case today.
Is it? Really?
Oh, yeah.
They have to have a sponsor?
Yes. My parents had to have sponsors as well. Well, they came in 48, 49.
From where?
Greece. There was a civil war at the time.
But how can they do that now? All these people don't have sponsors.
Yeah, they have
aunts.
They have aunts, uncles. Oh, well, refugees are different. But if you come in on a visa and you have to have somebody who will say, I'm putting them up or I'm going to feed them, or they don't want you on the public roles is the basic thing. Yeah, refugees are different. But if you come through the visa process.
I don't know. I don't think this country will ever be socialist. Bernie can work as hard as he wants to, but the capitalists will win. For one thing, we have too much fear.
Yeah, but it is curious. But I think you did put your finger on it, Helena, that if the social structures are strong enough, that affects how people think. And so it's if those get built up, people are going to think differently. So and this that sort of I think is a good argument in support of that reformist attitude is that the changes can have a way of snowballing on
Well,
them, building on themselves.
like with the ACA, all the resistance to it, and then you had people saying, I get rid of Obamacare, but don't take away my ACA. And um, now people love it.
Having experienced it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the same with Social Security and Medicare.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
So yeah. So I think it's possible to change that kind of thinking, but it would take some organizational changes in the way how people are living, to be sure.
The difficulty with us is that we're so big and unwieldy. We're like
Mhm.
6 countries.
Yeah.
Right.
One,
Yeah.
and we have the religious aspect, which always gums
yeah.
up the works.
Yeah. God will take care of you. Well, he's not doing the best. He's getting an F. Sorry.
Well, even worse than God will take care of you is God gave us Trump.
Yeah, that's true. How are we going to get rid of him?
And you're in real trouble. Okay. All right. So this next one is is a conversation with a guy with a woman named Nancy Fraser and a guy named Jason Moore, both professors and both more revolutionary. And so they're going to have a conversation. The two of them don't agree on everything, but they do seem to agree that they think that Saito's approach is too reformist and it should be revolutionary instead. And then there's some other kind of ideas from from Marxist criticisms of capitalist culture that they're going to get into that we'll talk about more in the next week or so. Okay, let's see what I can do with this one. Now, okay. Share. Let's see, that's this one, maybe. No, it's not that one.
We only have about.
Huh. All right. Gotta make that go away. Pull that up. There we go.
By saying a few words about Sigu. Most of you already know about what Sigu is, but we're really enthusiastic.
All right, I'm gonna skip the introductions.
So we established Sigu this past server, and you'll get more details very shortly. So let's give a warm round of welcome to our colleagues. And
thanks for that. So looking around the room, I know that a lot of you have been reading Nancy and Jason's work very closely for a long time, and some of you even more intensely recently. And so I think what we'll try to do is the three of us will talk for 30 or 40 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time to have a large collective conversation. And so what I'd like to do is sort of lay some groundwork, especially for folks who have not been reading your work closely in recent weeks, and then start to try to tease out some generative disagreements between the two of you and think with both of you. So for starters, kind of building on Neil's very nice introduction to your shared projects, right? Both of you have made a very strong case that particularly in this moment, it makes very little sense to think about capitalism narrowly as an economic system. Jason, you do this by describing capitalism as a way of organizing nature. Nancy, you do so by describing it as an institutionalized societal order. And so just to kind of lay some groundwork, I thought I would ask each of you to speak for maybe 5 minutes about sort of what you mean by those framing conceptions of what capitalism is, and then we'll go from there. So, Nancy, do you want to start off? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Well, what I mean, the problem with looking at capitalism only as an economic system, right, famously based on free wage labor and profit-oriented enterprise and so on and so forth, is that it doesn't allow us to understand all of the other bad things that capitalism necessarily generates over and above exploitation and bad treatment of free wage workers. And at present, this is especially problematic because I think we are in a general crisis of the entire societal order. And I believe that capitalism is at the root of that, but we won't know exactly how capitalism, if it's only an economy, is generating ecological crisis, social reproductive crisis, political crisis, racial justice crisis, and so on and so forth. So my idea is to look at what the conditions for the possibility are of a capitalist economy, what the conditions elsewhere in the social order are. The economy, you could say, is one system or subsystem or one institution, one arena of social interaction, many possible ways of describing it, but one among others that make up an entire social order. So I want to think of capitalism as something big on a par with feudalism, right? It's not just an economy. It's a way, I said this last night, of organizing the relation between the economy and its quote unquote non-economic background conditions. And those include social reproduction, they include environmental and ecological conditions, they include the organizations of public power, which is equally a condition for accumulation, and a whole realm of on or underwaged, expropriated human work that doesn't rise to the level of the official system of labor as economized. So I call all of that capitalism as an institutionalized social order. And to me, what's important is that this is an internally differentiated social order in which that consists in several fundamental structural divisions. The division of family from factory, the division of state from market, the division of quote unquote society from nature. All of these things are institutionalized in such a way as to create a lot of tensions which sometimes rise to the level of acute contradictions, as I would argue is the case now. So what we need to understand is how the societal order places the economy in relation to all of these things, and in a sense, licenses powerful economic actors to behave in all sorts of deeply destructive ways in relation to the non-economic zones of the society. Therefore, I think that capitalism has built into it a plurality of very concerning and destructive contradictions, not just the ones that Marx identified. I think that following O'Connor, I think there's a built-in ecological contradiction in capitalism over and above the contradiction between capital and official wage labor, over and above things like the falling rate of profit and so on. There's also a social reproductive contradiction built into it, and political contradictions built into it. I should say here, what I'm trying to do in thinking this way is bring together what I think of as the two Carls. There's a sort of Polanyian side of this, which has to do with the relation between economy and society, as he famously, right, elaborated. I don't agree with a lot of what Polanyi's up to. I think he may romanticize society a little too much and so on and so forth. But
I've heard that name, but I actually don't know much about him.
still, he's giving us the idea that there are inter-realm contradictions above and beyond any contradictions that are internal to the official economic system. There are also contradictions between the official economic system and these other background conditions. So ecological contradiction and so on and so forth. To me, this is a way of enriching traditional Marxism, using my dear old missed friend Moishe Posthone's phrase, enriching that account by showing that there are, all these other problematic dimensions of a capitalist societal order. And a critical theory of capitalism, importantly, needs to understand these other dimensions. And I would also argue that anyone who is concerned about transforming this order needs to understand these things as well.
Fantastic. Jason.
Do you guys have any questions about that? It's a little, she seems a little vague, but she just, basically that she just wants us to notice that there are lots of things going on that the economy connects to, but they're not necessarily the economy itself.
I would add health, human health.
Mm-hmm. I think that she might fit that in with the contradiction with the social reproduction.
I was thinking that too.
Okay.
What a treat it is to be here. So let me outline a bit about what world ecology with the hyphen, world ecology as a knowledge liberation movement tries to do. First of all, it's not a theory of everything. It is a knowledge movement. What is it a movement about? It's a protest against and an alternative to the tight relations between the structures of knowledge, the structures of power, and the structures of everyday life in the capitalist world ecology as it's taken shape over the past 5 centuries. That's important to keep in mind today because the long Malthusian cycle, even before Malthus himself, has been a fundamental challenge to socialist strategy, peasant, worker, national liberation movements across the longue durée, and struggling against the tyranny of man and nature, which is a creature of the civilizing project from Vittoria and the metaphysical instrumentalism of the Iberian scholastics, all the way through Descartes and Hobbes and Locke to Malthus to eugenics to point forward developmentalism and sustainable development in the Anthropocene today. This is a fundamental challenge for socialist politics to confront and make sense of, to get beyond the idea that in opposition to Marx and Engels' classic formulation, where the social relations of class society are doubly social natural, that on the one hand they are natural, on the other they are social in an irreducibly entwined way, that labor is itself a socio-ecological force, a specifically harnessed natural force of production that not only transforms environments, but in the act of transforming itself transforms the relations of class society and the metabolism of human social formations. That's important because it gets us beyond the 17th century bourgeois scientific revolution view of a collision of man versus nature. Are humans now overwhelming the great forces of nature, as the Anthropocene asks? That's precisely the wrong question to ask. Why? Because invariably it leads to the geomanagerial and technoscientific prescriptions that are at odds with any socialist project to deepen democratization over all of these fundamentally interconnected domains of life around the conditions of production and reproduction of capital, which are irreducibly socio-ecological, the conditions of care, the conditions of energy, et cetera, that Raj Patel and I talk about in A History of the World in 7 Cheap Things. So in many ways, that's the simplest argument to make, that human relations always form within webs of life. They are never separate. There is not a social moment over here and an ecological moment over there. That is a legacy of something I'll talk about in about 30 seconds, the civilizing project in capitalism. That these are irreducibly and dialectically joined, asymmetrically evolving in an ongoing historical geographical set of tensions. that this environment-making dialectic where, to borrow from Raymond Williams, who is ever a great resource, that environments are not only products of human relations, they are producers of those human relations, some more dialectical than others. Volcanoes erupt, whether we are in feudalism or capitalism or socialism or something entirely different. But how those social formations that are irreducibly socio-ecological internalize and adjust to volcanic eruptions, or as we're seeing horrifically in southern Turkey and northern Syria right now, the earthquakes. We need to fully internalize that logic of there is no such thing as a natural disaster, as environmental justice advocates have been saying now for about 15 years. All right, the other part of this that we have to deal with, and we have to have difficult discussions around this, is that nature is not only the most complex word in the language, as Raymond Williams said, it's also the most dangerous. And it's not merely an epistemological question or a philosophical question, although it is those. It is also a practical question of how domination, of forms of geocultural domination and class exploitation fit together over the longue durée of capitalism. And this is captured in the great Claudia von Berlehoff's quip that nature became everything the imperial bourgeoisie did not want to pay for. In other words, the unpaid work, which is never free and never gifted, but the unpaid work of, to quote Maria Mies, women, nature, and colonies. But what's often missed in that expression is that for Maria Mies, the problem was the worldwide class struggle and the dynamics of a fundamentally gendered and racialized set of primitive accumulation, which is premised on bourgeois naturalism and this underlying sense that nature is something out there. And that's a problem, not, as I said, not only epistemologically, but in terms of the emergence and development of capitalism as a system of cheap nature, which depends strategically on a qualitative form of super exploitation. Sylvia Federici has made this point very well in outlining the specifically gendered, juridical, and cultural forms of creating a new fetish, woman, which is itself an outcome of bourgeois naturalism, as she points out, that women became, in her words, the savages of Europe. That is, the unpaid workers who were super exploited in a qualitative sense to provide the necessary labor power and the semi-proletarian arrangements necessary for the uneven and combined development of capitalism on both sides of the Atlantic in this era. So in other words, for every proletarian moment of these class relations, there is a femitarian moment, a feminized unpaid work, not biologically reduced, as even Berlehoff sometimes suggested, but is feminized through this civilizing project. This goes on with the Lockean project of improvement and forbidding, when he wrote the Constitution for the Carolinas, forbidding indigenous peoples to enter into contract.
That said Locke. He's referring to John Locke. See, the word he used was Lockean.
Oh, I thought it was Lockheed Martin.
No, yeah, he's talking, Lockean, referring to John Locke in the 1700s.
With the English, again, living in a state of nature. This emerges not from 1492, but after 1570, with the drawing of the world color lines slowly, fitfully, first in Brazil, northeastern Brazil, then in the slave societies of the Caribbean, the Carolinas, and into the American South. So there is a long-run problem of bourgeois naturalism that has to be confronted, not just epistemologically and ideologically, but if we are to return to an older left conception of multiracial working class unity that I think goes well beyond intersectionality, it has to understand that the dominations in play are not an abstracted social reductionist conception of race, gender, sexuality, etc. These are actually rooted in the long-term historical dynamics of bourgeois naturalism that develops and fits and starts and reinvents itself. You think of Malthus, think about eugenics, think about the population bomb, neo-Malthusianism. There is a long-run ideological project at work that has to be confronted in the present moment to achieve anything that resembles climate justice. And that's where I would end. Thank you.
it's they're clearly both American professors.
Yes.
It's just yeah, listening to him sometimes just seems it's just a little over the top and clearly much phrased in a way that's much more complicated than it needs to be phrased. But what Moore here is known for is this emphasizing the ways in which capitalism evolved by taking advantage of things that were cheap to it. Natural resources, women's labor, slave labor, that you had to have all of these cheap inputs in order to create capitalism as we know it. And so resisting it requires recognizing all of those things are involved and that we have to figure out how to organize so that we're not relying on cheap inputs. And so that for him is sort of the biggest problem in overcoming capitalism is precisely the fact that all those things are connected, but they see themselves as disconnected.
Well, isn't it also, but cheap stuff, I understand, but isn't it at the other end that people want more and more, and especially the rich?
Well, he's definitely going to challenge the idea people want more, but he would say the rich want more. Yeah.
Well, I mean, we talk about bigger houses and
Yeah.
bigger cars. We used to have smaller cars. Now everybody has an SUV. I mean, sedans are a minority.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah, it's I think what he would want to point to is ways in which people are encouraged to think in certain ways and value.
Oh, yeah, okay, I can see that.
It's not human, it's not people's natural desires, that it's desires that have been cultivated.
Advertising.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I forgot how professorial they sound in this. So hopefully, I mean, I think it helps. The subtitles help a little bit, at least when they get the terms right. It's confusing if they get the word wrong. But
I have
they're
a question about that.
yeah.
I was wondering if maybe it was AI that was doing the character generation for
I think so.
because it gets things amazingly right,
Most of the time.
but something spectacularly wrong.
Yeah, yeah. That a person wouldn't make that mistake.
Right.
Yeah. Now, let's see. I should warn you. I think that a lot of this is valuable in it, but it gets more valuable as it builds. And the first part of it, I think really is kind of dry like this. But you need to know what they've said in the first part to make sense of what they're going to say in the second part. So unfortunately, we kind of need to live with some of this for a little bit before it gets really interesting. All right, how are we doing on time anyway? Okay.
So there's I think already a lot there that can be teased out in sort of subtle differences between how the two of you are thinking about these problems. But before we get there, one of the things that's striking about how both of you have been writing, particularly recently, is that there seems to be a strong agreement that in Origian terms, we're living through an epochal crisis. And so before asking kind of more specific questions about possible areas of disagreement, I wonder whether each of you would say a little bit about what you think the kind of constituent features of that epochal crisis are, and how we know that we're living through it.
Okay. Well, I think I want to plead at the outset a sort of agnosticism about the epochal character of the crisis. It's all hard to know in medias res whether this turns out to be merely a developmental crisis in which we
now here I think the AI did get us a little confused. So when the AI was picking up what the moderator was saying, it was thinking he meant apocalyptic. She's using the word epoch, that we're in one epoch or another epoch, not apocalyptical. So either way, we're talking about a change in some stage. Those two words are picking out, is the change a really bad one that we're looking at, or is it just a change? So in my, I'm actually from her answer makes sense, but his question made sense to me as apocalyptical too. So actually listening to them talk, I'm not entirely clear which way they really mean this to go. But if you just sort of keep that in mind, that she definitely means she's talking about epochs, historical epochs. And then we'll see what we can make of this.
Transition to some different form of capitalism, or whether we are really talking about the end of capitalism and the transition to some form of post-capitalism, whether awful or decent or something in between. Because of planetary heating, we do sort of have this sense of having reached some new kind of external limit, let's say. Jason might not approve that formulation, but I think that's an experienced feeling, whether we want to affirm it in the end or not. And so that's why I think people are quick to want to say this is for sure an epochal crisis. I do think there are external limits at the level of, how much greenhouse gas the planet can sequester and so on and so forth. I do think that, But I can't rule out a priori that some fraction of the capitalist class will find, some way of conceiving and getting the power and implementing something that could at least delay the inevitable, if it's really going to be inevitable. And so there might be some post-neoliberal regime of green capitalism, so to speak, and we should be fighting against that possibility for sure. One thing that I've argued is that, first of all, for me, the ecological is one strand of a multi-stranded general crisis. General crises are rare. They could, in principle, turn out to be epochal in the sense of transition out of capitalism. So far, they have transitioned to new forms of capitalism. Let's leave aside really existing communism and so on. In the interregnum, I said last night I'm very Gramscian in the way I think. We're in an interregnum of sorts.
It says grumpy. She said Gramscian, referring to the Italian philosopher Antonio Gramsci, who was a Marxist, died in the 1920s. And he's known for talking about how capitalism is able to create ideological cohesion. So I think that's what she's referencing there.
Sorts here. And interestingly, even in this country, climate denialism has really lost out. It's becoming a marginal, sort of kooky fringe. And more and more, people agree that there's something bad going on and that we humans are somehow responsible for it in part. That's, of course, the opening for Jason's move to contest that we humans a bit. Good.
This is also one of the things he's known for is this question of who do you mean by we? That we'll come back to a couple times.
Andreas Malm also makes this argument, and I'm completely on your side on this. But it means that we are now facing a plurality.
That was Andreas Malm, not another person I've heard of but don't know about.
Of proposals as to how to interpret the climate crisis, how to interpret the ecological strand of the general crisis. And as always in these situations, I'll say something that might surprise you for those of you who know a lot of my previous work. I think there's a moment of truth in the Schmittian idea.
Okay.
Smithian.
Why does she have to talk this way? Schmittian, referring to Carl Schmitt, who was a very important philosopher in Germany just prior to the Nazis taking power, who is known as a great theorist of fascist politics. So he talks about how society needs to become this total, needs to encompass everything, sort of be totalizing. But why she has to say that, I don't know.
About us versus them. I think we have to find some way of simplifying this field of confused, competing ideas about what to do into an us versus them. And I think it should be us against every form of green capitalism. So, and then we'll see whether, there is a socialist or some kind of good post-capitalist thing, and then it turns out to be an epochal crisis, or whether we get green capitalism, or whether we just get some form of barbarism, which is, also a possibility. The last point, in insisting that the ecological dimension is one strand, I want to suggest that ecological movements and environmental struggles, however good, are not able on their own to actually, make a good societal transformation. I think that people for whom environmental crisis is their most pressing existential problem, and who want to organize under that banner and fight that fight, are going to have to be allied with other people. And this is not an objective question as to what has priority, but other people who experience something else as their most pressing problem, whether it's that their children are being shot down in the street by police or whatever. So I see a situation in a general crisis with multiple strands. There are going to be multiple forms of response that are potentially emancipatory. But whether anything good comes out of this has to do with whether they can recognize one another as fellow travelers who all share a need, however differently situated, in transforming the societal order and the forces within it that are driving the destruction of the life conditions of everyone.
Okay, so the big point she's just trying to make at the end there is that if there's going to be kind of political progress, that's obviously going to take people who have different primary issues of their politics cooperating and seeing that they have common problems. That for her, she would point out that whatever that is, if it's a feminist issue or a race issue, environmental issue, an animal rights issue, that fundamentally they're all anti-capitalist issues, and so they're going to all need to see that together for there to be real progress to get unity of the opposition to capital. Okay, so we're getting close to the end. I'll put off Jason Moore's reply till next week. So, any thoughts here?
I was really impressed with it. It seems sort of jarring to me for some reason. She's talking so negatively about green capitalism. Does she think that's an oxymoron?
Yeah, I think that's probably it's sort of greenwashed capitalism.
You can't have capitalism and responsible environmental policies.
Right.
Wow.
Now, Saito's saying the same thing, that it's just that it's in the
Yeah.
nature of capitalism and how it extracts wealth, that it can't possibly be environmental. It has to. And so they all three so Saito and Moore and Nancy Fraser here, they're all going to agree on sort of on that basic analysis, but they'll emphasize it in different ways.
It's just so funny to hear green, to hear, green is supposed to be good.
Mm-hmm.
And to hear it whatever, with capitalism, green capitalism, bad.
Mm-hmm.
It's a new idea for me.
Mm.
Well, I may have mentioned this before, but my understanding is if you're a corporation, a publicly traded corporation, that is, your first obligation is profit to the shareholders. Yeah. And so if by legal contract, that's your vision, that's your view, that's your reason for being, then workers' rights, the environment, how you treat people is superfluous.
Mm-hmm.
I know there was a company that, I think it was Honest Soap, some small company that was trying to do healthy, environmentally friendly things, and their board of directors just slam dunked them.
Mm.
And said, well, that's not profitable. It's cheaper if you get chemicals in there rather than natural products. So, yeah.
Now that is a peculiarly American thing. Not every country has those laws, has a law that stipulates that the corporation has this primary obligation.
Oh, that's interesting.
It's in the nature of the capitalist firm to behave that way. But here that you have the added bit that if it's publicly traded, there are these other laws that are governing how publicly traded corporations behave.
Oh, that's interesting.
And there are people who have talked about, that that one way around that little problem is that if you start off by organizing the corporation as not for profit, it can still earn profits, but it wouldn't have the same desire built in. Now, of course, that wouldn't be a publicly traded corporation either, but it still could be big. You could still have a big corporation, but if it was organized specifically as something that wasn't intended primarily to generate profits, then you would generate different behaviors. So we do have legal structures to take advantage of that kind of organizing in reformist ways if people were to do it. And there are probably examples out there that I don't have off the top of my head, but I'm sure they're out there.
If I was queen, I would say there should be no profit generated from anything that humans need.
Yeah, that's I think
that should be a rule that it just boggles the mind that we can make profit off of people's illness.
Yes.
And that's too, that's the Saito when he's talking about the commons and decommodification. It's exactly that point that he's after. Yeah. That the things that we really need shouldn't be commodities.
And to your point, you can still make money in a nonprofit. It's just not as much.
Yeah.
And now we are giving money to people to have babies. Where is that going?
Oh,
that is so crazy. I mean, he's really following the Russian playbook.
Oh.
Yes, but at the same time, we're taking away funding from Head Start. So, no help in raising children,
I agree with you, Jane.
Yes.
Yeah. There was one of the female Congress members was making that point. If you actually wanted to encourage people to have children, you have to do other things.
Yeah, duh.
Much more meaningful. And Head Start being being a big one for that. Yeah. Yeah, that part, is actually, it just seems at some point just kind of psychotically disconnected from reality, because
Yes.
he does seem really, really committed to this idea, and then everything he does undermines the things that you would do socially to make that happen. And then he comes up with weird little schemes that he thinks somehow will compensate.
Well, because in his brain, money is the ultimate motivator. He sees no other motivate. He can't believe
Yeah.
many of us have other motivations besides money.
That's the problem, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
How much
It
we're
is part of the
socialized.
problem. Yeah.
Kooky people.
And now you can come into the States and you pay, I think, $10,000 or $50,000.
No,
And then you come in.
millions. No, millions.
Million? 5 million.
I don't know how many million, but
The
it
gold
was in
card.
it was in the millions.
Oh yeah, the gold card.
Yeah, right.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
And other countries have golden visas, and I don't know how much money you have to pay in other countries.
I've never heard of them.
Yeah, yeah, it's called golden visas.
Yeah.
In
I
different
think it's
countries.
changing.
Yeah, because there's a lot of people.
So many I had a daughter who had worked very hard to get a Portuguese visa under the original requirements, immigration lawyers and all that, and now they're changing the whole playing field. I think the same is true maybe with Italy and Spain.
Oh yeah.
There's no refuge in this world. That's the way I feel today. None.
Well, is there something we can hope for? Is it something good?
Well, I feel like you can work for something, and working towards something is hoping, right?
Yeah.
Even if it's just one small thing,
Yeah.
And as we speak, there are probably thousands of people at Cal Anderson Park.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Right. Exactly.
Right.
Plenty of other places to go today too, though.
And I increased my donations to the ACLU, so
yeah,
that's good.
I mean,
there's resistance. There's always resistance.
Yes,
that's about all we got right now.
All right, folks, I'll let you go.
Is
your daughter pursuing it under
No, she gave up because she said that wealthy expats have kind of ruined the whole environment there, because she said that the housing is getting ridiculous and that every activity there is monetized. So it's just she disagrees with the principle, and it's probably not feasible for her anymore. So I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I'm sure we all know people who fled or are in the process of, but
Yeah, people lining up their passports.
Yeah. Anyway,
interesting.
Nice to talk with you all.
All righty, y'all have a good week. Enjoy the
Bye.
film.
Thank you.
See you next week.